Max and Melissa were sitting in a cozy coffee shop on the corner of the university campus. Max, a tall and slender guy with short dark hair and penetrating brown eyes, nervously stirred his coffee with a spoon. His athletic physique stood out even in casual clothes, jeans, and a t-shirt. Melissa, a petite girl with long blonde hair and blue eyes, was sitting across from him, clutching a mug of hot tea. She looked delicate and fragile, but there was strength and determination in her eyes. "Max, I do not know what to do," Melissa said softly, lowering her eyes. "My friends and family just don't understand you." Max sighed, leaning back in his chair. He was already used to these conversations, but they hurt him every time. "Why do they hate me so much, Melissa?" "What is it?" he asked, looking into her eyes. "I tried to show them that I had changed. I'm not the cocky guy I used to be anymore." Melissa looked at him sadly. "They just don't believe that you can change," she replied. "They remember you the way you were in high school. They think you're using me." Max frowned, his brows drawn together. "I love you, Melissa," he said firmly. "Why can't they understand it?" Melissa reached across the table and took his hand. "I believe you, Max," she said. "But they won't let us rest. Every time we're together, they tell me that you're not my match." At that time, 3 girls, Melissa's friends, came into the coffee shop. They were dressed in stylish outfits that set them apart from the crowd. The looks they cast at Max were full of contempt. "Hi, Melissa," said one of them, Ashley, a tall brunette with bright blue eyes. "We thought you'd join us after class." Melissa cast an anxious glance at Max. "I'm sorry, girls, but I have plans with Max," she replied. Ashley crossed her arms over her chest and looked at Max. "Are you really going to keep doing this?" "What is it?" she'd asked. "We all know that Max is not who he claims to be." Max stood up and looked her straight in the eye. "I have changed, Ashley," he said quietly. "Why can't you give me a chance?" Ashley snorted contemptuously. "We've seen how you used to be, Max," she said, "and we don't believe that you can change." Melissa stood up and walked over to Max, putting her hand on his shoulder. "I believe in him," she said firmly, "and I ask you to respect my choice." Ashley and her friends exchanged glances and, without saying another word, left the coffee shop. Max and Melissa remained standing in silence, feeling the tension hanging in the air. "Thank you for standing up for me," Max said quietly after the girls had left. Melissa nodded and hugged him. "I will always be by your side," she whispered. Max was sitting on a park bench, watching the leaves fall quietly from the trees. Melissa was sitting next to him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Tell me about your parents, Max," Melissa asked softly, raising her blue eyes to him. Max was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The memories were painful, but he knew Melissa deserved to know the truth. "They were wonderful people," he began, taking a deep breath. "My mom always supported me in everything, and my dad was my role model. We were very close." Melissa tightened her grip on his hand. "What happened? What is it?" she'd asked cautiously. Max frowned, his gaze darkening. "It was the summer before my last year at school," he continued. "We went on a family vacation. It was a long drive, and I dozed off in the back seat. I woke up to a terrible sound and a sharp jolt. When I opened my eyes, it was already over." Melissa shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, Max," she whispered, not knowing how to express her sympathy. Max smiled slightly, trying to soften the pain in her eyes. "Everything changed after that," he said. "I gave up all my entertainment and focused only on my studies and sports. It was the only way to deal with the loss." Melissa sighed softly and put her arm around his shoulders. "I understand why you've changed so much," she said, "and I'm proud of you for being able to get through it." Max turned to her and looked straight into her eyes. "You helped me, Melissa," he said. "You showed me that life goes on and that you can find happiness even after such losses." Melissa smiled and snuggled closer to him. "We can handle everything together," she said confidently. "And no one can stop us." Max nodded and hugged her. It was important for him to know that there was a person next to him who understood and supported him. At that moment, he felt that he could handle any difficulties as long as Melissa was around. Max stood by the lake, holding a fishing rod and watched the reflection in the water. Next to him was Melissa's father, Jonathan, a burly man with gray hair and a stern expression. There was silence all around, broken only by the occasional splashing of fish. "Good catch," Jonathan muttered, looking at the fish that Max caught just a few minutes after the fishing started. Max nodded, trying to find a common language with this man. "Yes, it's not bad," he replied, trying to keep the conversation going. Jonathan looked at Max, his gaze cold and appraising. "I wonder what else your parents taught you before they committed suicide." Suddenly, he said. Max froze. His face turned pale, and he slowly lowered the fishing rod. He looked at Jonathan in disbelief. "What did you say?" he asked quietly, trying not to show his emotions. Jonathan shrugged as if nothing had happened. "You heard," he replied calmly. Max could feel the anger growing inside him. He dropped the fishing rod and turned to Jonathan. "It was too much," he said, barely able to keep the tremor out of his voice. "I don't have to put up with this." Max turned around and walked back to his car, feeling tears welling up in his eyes. He knew he couldn't stay here anymore. Melissa called him on the way. Her voice was agitated. "Max, where are you?" "What is it?" she asked, hearing his heavy breathing. "I'm leaving," he replied shortly, trying not to show his emotions. Melissa panicked. "What happened? Please tell me." Max stopped and closed his eyes, trying to calm down. "Your father has crossed all boundaries," he said. "He said something terrible about my parents. I can't stand it." Melissa was silent for a few seconds, then her voice faltered. "I'm sorry, Max. I didn't know they could be so cruel. Please don't go," she begged. Max sighed heavily. He knew it wasn't Melissa's fault, but the feeling of resentment and anger was too strong. "I need time," he said, getting into the car. "I'll talk to you later." He started the car, trying not to think about what had happened. He needed to leave and sort out his thoughts. Max sat in his room, trying to put his thoughts in order. His friend Logan, a tall and thin guy with red hair and freckles, was sitting across from him. Logan was the only one Max could trust. "Max, I know what you're going through," Logan began, staring at his friend. "But it seems to me that something is wrong here." Max frowned, looking up at Logan. "What do you mean? What is it?" he asked, not understanding what his friend was talking about. Logan sighed and rubbed his forehead. "I've heard some strange things from Melissa's friends," he replied. "They said that the reason her family hated you was because of some old misunderstanding." Max frowned harder, remembering all the past conflicts. "What kind of misunderstanding? What is it?" he asked, feeling a growing unease. Logan sighed and looked at Max seriously. "Do you remember the summer before your last year of school?" he began. "You used to hang out with guys and girls a lot back then." Max nodded, trying to figure out what Logan was getting at. "Yes, I remember," he replied. "We often rode at night back then." Logan looked at him even more intently. "One of those girls was Melissa's older sister," he said. "And there was one night when you took her and another girl, and something happened." Max frowned, remembering that night. "Yes, I remember," he said. "But what's the big deal? We were just riding." Logan took a deep breath. "The problem is, they both got pregnant after that night," he said. "And Carter, your friend, blamed everything on you to preserve his relationship with his father." Max froze, realizing that the truth had finally surfaced. "Are you serious?" he whispered, feeling his heart constrict. Logan nodded. "Yes, and Melissa knew it," he added. "But she couldn't tell you the truth because of her sisters." Max felt his anger rise. He got up and started pacing the room. "Why didn't she say anything?" he exclaimed. "I trusted her." Logan sighed, realizing the complexity of the situation. "She was afraid, Max," he said softly. "I was afraid of losing you and my family." At that moment, the door opened and Melissa entered the room. She looked upset. Her eyes were red from crying. "Max, I'll explain everything," she began, but he raised his hand to stop her. "You knew the truth and kept quiet," he said, looking at her with pain in his eyes. "Why?" Melissa began to cry, her shoulders shaking. "I couldn't tell you," she said through tears. "I was afraid you'd leave." Max felt his heart being torn apart. He didn't know how to react to this betrayal. You betrayed my trust, he said softly, trying not to show his pain. I do not know how we can continue. Melissa fell to her knees, begging him to forgive her. Please, Max, give me a chance to fix this, she begged. I love you. Max stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest like a hammer. He knew this was the moment that would change their lives forever. The next evening, Max sat in his room feeling a heavy heart. He replayed the conversation with Melissa over and over in his head. It was slowly getting dark outside the window, and the first stars began to appear in the sky. He knew that he had to make a difficult choice. The door opened softly, and Melissa entered the room. Her eyes were red from crying, and her face looked tired. She walked slowly over to Max and sat down opposite him. Max, we need to talk, she said softly, trying to keep her voice from trembling. Max nodded without taking his eyes off the floor. I know, Melissa, he replied. I've been thinking about it too. She looked at him with hope in her eyes. Please, Max, don't go, she whispered. I will do everything to make you trust me again. Max looked up and looked straight into her eyes. It's not that easy, Melissa, he said softly. Your betrayal has left a deep mark. Melissa nodded, her tears starting to flow down her cheeks again. I understand, she whispered, but I love you. I'm ready to fight for us. Max sighed and rubbed his temples. He knew that the decision had already been made, but he needed to voice it. I love you too, Melissa, he said, looking at her with pain. But I can't continue to live in lies and distrust. Melissa covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Please, Max, give me a chance to fix this, she begged. I'm ready to do anything to make you happy. Max took her hands and squeezed them tightly. You have to understand that this is not just a problem between us, he explained. This applies to everyone around us. Your family, my friends. I cannot continue to live in this constant struggle. Melissa looked at him through tears, her eyes filled with despair. So this is the end? She asked softly, not believing her ears. Max nodded, feeling his heart break apart. Yes, he said with difficulty. We need to break up. This is the best solution for both of us. Melissa stood up, her legs shaking. I do not know how I will live without you, she said, trying to hold back tears. Max got up and hugged her tightly, feeling his own tears begin to come to his eyes. You'll do fine, Melissa, he whispered. You're strong, and I hope that one day you will find someone who will make you happy. They stood hugging each other until the sky outside the window was covered with darkness. Max knew he had made the right choice, but that didn't make it any easier. They had a new life ahead of them, and each of them had to start it from scratch. That's how the story ended. Leave your opinion in the comments about this story. We will be interested to know what you think. Also, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to our channel. That way you won't miss new exciting stories. Good luck to you.